Good afternoon. This is Victoria Beal with the Ohio LTAP Center, and I've got 1 o'clock on my computer, so we're going to go ahead and get things going. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. This afternoon we have a webinar for you from the Active Transportation Academy, and it's an overview of a course offered through the Active Transportation Academy, Advocating for Active Transportation. Our presenter is Amelia Mansfield with Burton Planning, and before I turn things over to Amelia, we're going to have a couple of small housekeeping items. First off, everyone has been joined to the webinar as an attendee, and you are in listen-only mode currently, but we do encourage questions throughout the webinar. So on your screen, hopefully at the bottom left-hand corner, if you do not have a chat pod or conversation panel already, you see a circle with a thought bubble in it. You can click on that, just click once, and it should open your conversation panel on the left. We encourage questions throughout the webinar, and I will be reading any questions that come in during the presentation to Amelia for responses. Also, we are attempting to record this webinar, and if we're successful, we will post the recording and send a link out to everyone who had registered. But in case we aren't successful, it's a good thing you're here, because you're going to get it firsthand and live. So with that, Amelia, you ready to take things away? You might have yourself muted. Well, while she's working on that, one of the things that I will tell you is that through the Active Transportation Academy, the courses are provided at no cost to local agencies, and if you are not with a local agency, if you're with a partner to a local agency, then you can work through a local agency to apply for a course through the Active Transportation Academy.
Can you hear me now?
I sure
okay,
can.
Great. All right.
Wonderful. It's all yours.
We should have done a contest on how many times we would say active transportation in this one presentation. So I feel like we've said it so many times already. We're only a few minutes in, but thank you for the introduction, Victoria. Again, my name is Amelia Mansfield. I'm with Burton Planning Services, and we help ODOT manage the Active Transportation Academy. I have a few different roles. Some of you may have been in a course through the Active Transportation Academy where I was an instructor. On the team that develops the courses, including the one we're going to cover today. And then I try to keep everything moving along seamlessly when you send in your requests and otherwise as the project manager. So you're always welcome to reach out to me as well as Victoria should you have any questions. So today we're going to spend a few minutes talking about the Active Transportation Academy in general, in case you aren't familiar with it. We're going to talk about what the Advocating for Active Transportation course learning outcomes are, and then highlight topics that you would be learning about should you host or attend the actual 4-hour training in a community across Ohio. And then finally, how to apply. So first of all, well, Victoria had already made a few remarks about the Active Transportation Academy, but just to get into slightly more detail, the whole idea behind it is to offer trainings to communities like yours to help you reach your active transportation goals. And we do this by offering free trainings and workshops to communities all across Ohio, no matter how large or small. The application is open to any local jurisdiction who might want to host, and that would include anything from a local planning or engineering department to a school or school district, a health department, just as long as you're a local government-related entity. And if you're not, we encourage you to partner with one of them and bring it to your community that way. We do offer professional development credits, which I know is something that drives people to want to attend, on top of just great conversation and building relationships. If you want more information, you can follow the link that's on the slide once Victoria makes it available online, or you can always just Google ODOT LTAP Active Transportation Academy. You may have heard about this academy in the past when it was called the Safe Routes Academy. We went through a rebranding over the past year and a half, so now we're the Active Transportation Academy to capture the fact that we're not just talking about safe routes to school, we're also talking about safe routes to everywhere. We have 5 new courses that we've been able to unroll over the past year, and they're listed here, all 4-hour courses, 4 hours of continuing education credits, all touching on active transportation and safe routes to everywhere, but all with slightly different spin depending on what your community's interest is, where you are in your different planning processes, and what kind of partnering entities you might be working with. We also offer some what we call train the trainer courses, and these are meant to do exactly as the title would implicate, which is training someone who's in the workshop to then provide trainings to additional people, so to keep spreading that information outward. And so these have to do with safe routes to school specific topics, so everything from how do you lead a walking school bus to how do you effectively be an adult school crossing guard, how do you conduct a school walk audit, and then how do you lead Girls in Gear programs. And so again, the idea would be if you were to host this training, you would be inviting people who would ultimately be in charge of these programs at their own schools or in their own communities, and they would then teach the same program to the people that would actually be leading the school bus. They would actually teach the crossing guards. They would host the Girls in Gears programs, and they would conduct the school walk audits. And these are all interactive. Get out on the street, actually, practice what we're learning in the classroom on the same day. There are other Safe Routes to School related trainings that are more about how to implement programs. They're listed here. Again, most of them are 4-hour courses. Our Safe Routes to School lesson plans, sorry for the typo there, is a longer course because we do want to come out of it knowing the intimate details of how to create a Safe Routes to School lesson plan. We also offer the opportunity to combine multiple trainings into a day if that's of interest to you. So always feel free in your application to say that you're interested in more than one, and we can talk about how to accommodate that. Coming soon, we're going to be creating a Vision Zero, or creating a Vision Zero action plan course, which we know is at the top of everyone's mind throughout the nation and in Ohio. So stay tuned for that. There'll be a webinar in December to give a course overview. But then we're also going to be putting our crossing guard training online on demand. That way people are able to take that training at their own leisure and still get credit for it and be trained in how to effectively train other crossing guards and how to be a crossing guard themselves.
Hey, Amelia, this is Victoria.
Yep.
I'm going to chime in real quick. I anticipate that we'll have that published out by the end of this week.
Excellent.
So everybody here on the call will be the first to know. Just watch for the LTAP listserv announcement. Thanks.
And we're doing this based also on hearing feedback that with school crossing guards specifically, a lot of times being volunteers or being associated with the school staff, there's oftentimes not the opportunity to attend an all-day or a half-day training that's outside of in-service days for teachers. So this is a way to accommodate those needs and make sure our crossing guards feel like they are equipped with all the information they need to effectively get children safely to school. Okay, so with that, getting into what we came here today to talk about in more detail is what the Advocating for Active Transportation course will actually teach you. And so the point of this webinar today isn't to get into all of the details because we want you to sign up to host this in your community. And it's a 4-hour course and there's no way we would get through the material in 45 minutes. So know that it's more meant to be an overview like the title would suggest, and it's ends up being quite more detailed. So just so you know, there are a few goals that we aim to achieve with the trainees walking away from the 4-hour course. And so the first is understanding the basics of advocacy, knowing that a lot of people understand what advocacy means, but guaranteeing that they're going to walk away with some new revelation. There's going to be something shared during the day that they wouldn't have known before about how to define advocacy and what it actually means. So then we're going to be able to identify and understand the advocacy issues that exist in your particular community. So not just across Ohio, not just across the nation, but in your village, in your county, through your school district. And then, we're hoping that you're going to also walk away with a strategy for building advocacy in your community. So those building blocks, so that when you go back to your office or you go back to your community, you can say, I went through this 4-hour training, I had these action steps, I know who I'm going to talk to, I know the first few things I'm going to do. That way you feel empowered to actually start, so that there's some progress made when you walk out of that training. So the course is split up into 3 parts. The first is, what is advocacy? And so, as I had mentioned, we would define advocacy, and again, knowing that it's a very common term these days, something that has probably touched all of us in one way or another, whether we were the advocate or someone who was advocating for us. You'll still learn something new, especially when we define advocacy in the context of active transportation. That might be something that's a little less familiar to you. Then we would talk about active transportation inequities and how that relates to the need for advocacy, and then best practices in active transportation advocacy in particular. So, just a little teaser of what the parts having to do with defining advocacy might look like is pulling out some different definitions from the basic dictionary, from the Alliance for Justice as an example, which is focused on advocacy work, and having the trainees discuss this. Throughout the entire training, we aim to do a lot of interactive elements, so not just discussion, but also activities. That way people can learn in different ways. They have an opportunity to work together to build those relationships, and depending on what kind of person you are, you might love having someone lecture to you, and that's fine. There's definitely that in the training, but if you're someone who likes more hands-on or more conversational approaches to learning, then we also offer that. So then we get into talking about different activities that comprise advocacy work, just to list it out, because not all of these things are necessarily at the top of our minds when we're thinking about advocacy. At least I can say that for my own self. So advocacy activities could be everything from organizing people to educating decision makers and local leaders, educating the public, producing research that's relevant to advocacy issues, and then actually taking action. It seems like a lot of times people look at that last bullet point as what advocacy means, but really all these other things can play into it as well. We also talk about different types of advocacy. Again, this is something that you wouldn't necessarily deconstruct when you're out in the field. But as a background bit of information, we think it's pretty helpful to understand that, there's the types of advocacy where you actually work with a person or group and communicate what they need or what they want. But there's also advocacy that people and groups do to communicate their own needs. And so probably in a lot of the work that you and the trainees would be doing, it would be this instructed advocacy of working as a transportation or planning or public health, et cetera, professional to communicate what a particular group who's suffering an inequity would need, less of the self-driven. There's also a difference between doing advocacy work because a person or a group is legally entitled to it versus advocating for a person or group because you see an issue and, whether or not there's a law in place that says it's your duty to advocate for them, you're still going to do it. So then we also talk about, why do we need active transportation related advocacy specifically? We talk about inequities related to all of these bullet points here. Some of this is also similar to information that we talk about in our health and equity and transportation training. It's not by any means duplicative, but it's actually kind of paired together nicely. So if you've taken that training, this is a great next step. And if you take this training and want more, you could sign up to host that health and equity and transportation training as well. But we get into a lot of details about all of these. I'm not going to get into them in this presentation today, but we share a lot of data, research from around the country, research from governmental entities all the way to nonprofit organizations, and talk about how inequities specifically relate to active transportation. And I was remiss to mention at the beginning that when we talk about active transportation, we're looking through the lens of walking, biking, transit ridership, anything that isn't driving your own vehicle alone or being in a personal vehicle. So we talk about best practices in active transportation advocacy as well. We know that people like to point to something that has been done effectively somewhere else before they adopt it as their own. So we talk about this in general terms and specific terms. So generally we talk about wanting to have a clear mission for your advocacy work, having an action plan, and that's a part of what this training helps to outline. You want to build a base of supporters because you can't do it alone. You want to build in that education to not only your partners and your supporters, but yourself, and then being able to stay connected to other advocates. But then in particular, we talk about these 6 different entities and what they're doing, either across North America or in a particular community for transportation and active transportation advocacy. And some of them are specific to a place that is not in Ohio, but that's okay because we can take a look at what they've done and think about what our roles might be in trying to do similar efforts in our Ohio communities. But then others, like for example, Yay Bikes, are located in Ohio, and so they're not only inspirational, but they can actually be a resource to us as well. So the second part of the training is talking about your community specifically. So being able to identify what affects the function and form of streets, what are the strengths and weaknesses of active transportation, but then particularly how do you affect active transportation issues in your community? What are the issues in your community? And then how would you actually start to address them? So something that is a common thread in all of the Active Transportation Academy trainings is talking about history and about law and about the built environment and how that affects the work that we do as planners, engineers, public health professionals, school officials, whatever it might be. So we like to talk a little bit about the history of suburbanization and auto-oriented sprawl and development and how that affects the form and function of streets, and in a lot of communities across Ohio is most conducive to driving a personal vehicle rather than walking, biking, or riding transit. We talk about federal policies in the past, but also currently that encourage suburban development, and in the context of, again, the streets that are more conducive to driving a vehicle rather than accommodating multi-modes. And we also talk about the design in specific of streets and how that can impact whether or not people feel safe or actually are safe walking and biking, and even driving. We look at crash data, we look at the actual land use, we look at the size and dimensions of different properties and how they're associated with one another. And a lot of times we get into some great conversation with the more technical experts in the room in these trainings about how this impacts their work and how they address this in their own communities, and if they don't, what are those constraints that prevent them from doing so. So then we get into, what are the strengths and weaknesses of active transportation? And it wouldn't be fair just to say that active transportation is always a strength in a community. It can also be a weakness in some regards, and so how do we understand that, and how does that apply to our advocacy work when we're trying to make sure that our communities are supportive of active transportation. So we talk about how strengths and weaknesses can be fit into these categories of policies, systems, and environment. We also talk about the presence or absence of supportive processes and programs, multimodal aspects in our road networks. We talk about whether our road network is safe or not, what is the accessibility of active transportation facilities in our community, and then again, how does the design of the road network and the surrounding areas relate to active transportation as either a strength or a weakness in our community. And we look at specific examples too. So if you were to sign up to host this course, there'd be some back and forth between my team and your team to pull out some examples from your community. That way everyone who's in the training feels like it's relatable and we can actually look at real world examples. So, we also want to talk about understanding the decision-making structure based on the scale and location of the issue that you're interested in addressing. And so these are just two examples, but it's just meant to be demonstrative to say that, for example, if say your transportation plan or your school is interested in air quality and how active transportation can help to make air quality better, you might be interested in doing some advocacy work at the state level, working with Ohio EPA. And so understanding, based on where you're located and based on what that particular advocacy issue is that you're looking to address, there are different districts to go to, there are different people to go to, and understanding, who those might be in your community and what the approach might be to actually reach out to them. And so this is another opportunity where we can customize the presentation. If there's a particular issue that you as the host know is facing your community, we can dig a little bit deeper and actually lay out what that decision-making structure might be that you would be reaching out to work on advocacy. So then the last section, which is really the meat and potatoes, if you will, is talking about steps toward advocacy. So in this part of the training, this is actually over an hour and a half of the training is in the third part here, is where we're actually putting together those tangible takeaway items. It's where we're doing a lot of the interactive activities together. And so we would be talking about how to effectively address active transportation issues, how to build a strong message, how to make change with elected officials, and really understanding what your role is, regardless of who you are in your community, and then how do we build this culture of advocacy for active transportation in your community. And a very essential part of that culture is working with elected officials and knowing that that can be really tricky, so talking in detail about how to start there. So there are several different approaches and steps, if you will, to effectively addressing active transportation issues. So we get into each of these in quite a lot of detail. And like I had mentioned earlier in this webinar, I'm not going to go into the detail today, but just know that it's meant to be a deeper dive. That way people can walk away understanding what the specifics of all of this mean. But just as a little bit of a teaser here, looking at first the approach of, developing a message, people hire experts to, do their marketing and their message development. And, that just goes to show how big of an undertaking it can be. But we want to try to break it down into smaller steps and actually work in an interactive activity to come up with some messaging techniques. That way, regardless of what your budget is, regardless of what the scope of your active transportation advocacy efforts are, you can feel like you at least understand the basics of developing a message related to your advocacy work. So we talk about the importance of clear and consistent and cohesive messaging. We talk about where you get that message from, and so not just starting from scratch, but looking at your organization's mission statement or looking at goals that are in a plan that you already have. whether that's your school travel plan or your community transportation plan or comprehensive plan or whatnot. And then talking about who might be responsible for creating this message. It doesn't have to be you. Just because you're the one at the training doesn't mean that you're the one that has to do it. But how do you identify who the appropriate people are? Another effective way to address these active transportation issues through advocacy is establishing model policies. And so we talk about how do we build projects and programs that support or directly motivate active transportation. And so we're able to customize, again, the presentation when we work with you as the host prior to the training to take a look at what kind of projects and programs you already have in place or what kind of laws and regulations and design guidelines, et cetera. That way we can pull them up, we can look through them, we can point to different things and say, look, you as a community have already started, you're this far in, what can we do with these model policies you already have to keep this ball rolling? And if you don't have any of these things in place, let's talk about why and what some of the blockades have been and how we might be able to get past those. We get into some examples of specific laws, policies, and plans, both from across the nation and from across Ohio. And again, this is another place where we can pull specific examples that might relate to whatever advocacy issue your community is interested in addressing, or if you don't know, we can, just point to some of those best practices that we would normally integrate into the presentation materials. So another approach that we like to talk about is our demonstration projects and activities. And so, how do we incorporate things like walk and bike audits, community bike rides, tactical urbanism, which is those short-term demonstration projects for active transportation facilities and programs, to actually build community awareness and interest, to test out how some different changes to our community might actually affect this transportation inequity that you're facing. And so that's also a place where we're able to point to great work that you may have done before or what other communities are doing that you could easily duplicate. Another approach we talk about that's essential to effectively addressing active transportation issues in your community is building some sort of group that is dedicated to working on your advocacy issue or issues. Going back again to just because you're the one person from your department that's in this training, or just because you're one small section of a community doesn't mean that you need to be responsible. That's actually better if there are more people involved. And so thinking about how to build your group, who's going to be involved, what their roles are going to be, and then understanding that having a cross-sector group will really be most beneficial to you. And again, looking at examples of other coalitions, committees, task forces, et cetera, that communities across Ohio and beyond have put together specifically to address active transportation advocacy issues, or also looking at groups that have had that as a side benefit. Last but not least, we look to Healthy Places by Design's community action model, which is a great visual tool that takes a look at the importance of partnership processes and progress in advocacy efforts. And so their main focus is really about community context and how that's crucial, and so how your particular culture and history and policies, et cetera, really can impact the way that your community takes action on these advocacy issues. And so we get into this in some detail. That way, if you are the type of person or the type of entity that likes to use a model, then we have one for you. So the first interactive activity is going through a policy assessment checklist that we've taken from an organization that put together a way for you to look at your existing bike and pedestrian and transit policies and actually assess them based on different criteria. And so it's not a one-size-fits-all or, you know, the last step in the road to your advocacy efforts, but it's a great place to start to say, okay, let's take a look in our community at our existing policies, and let's apply them to this checklist and see where there are gaps or where there are really some great strengths that we could build off of as we start to work on these advocacy issues. And so that's one of those things that we would give you time to work together in small groups or individually, however you prefer to start doing some of this work. We also like to give resources that support advocacy efforts, and so all of these organizations we would talk about in some more detail. We would take a look at the websites and share with you how they could be helpful to you in your efforts specifically. And then if there are actual resources that are tailored to your community, then we would add them to this list as well. And so that's something that we would also want to be talking with you as a host prior to see if there are organizations that specifically serve your community that we might want to call attention to. So we get into then more detail about building a strong message. So we would have assessed our policies, we would have understood how that all fits together, and then we would say, okay, the next step here is how do we build a strong message? How do we understand what it is that we actually want to focus on just to bite off a small chunk rather than feeling like the weight of the world is on our shoulders with our active transportation inequities, just picking one or picking one sort of cohesive message to focus on. And so we look at these 4 different steps. The first one, knowing the issues your community is facing, is something we will have already talked about throughout the prior hour and a half of the training. And so that's, you know, check that off the list. We know what your community is facing. So then we're going to go through the next steps. We're going to understand who your audience is and that you would want to be working with on these advocacy issues and how active transportation could benefit the things they're interested in. And so we talk about, you know, if you are if you are a public health entity and you're interested in working on air quality issues, then you really feel like you need to pull in, let's say, your local economic development group for some reason, then you would be able to look at this matrix that we've put together. And by using this chart, you'd be able to remind yourself of what some of these benefits of active transportation are, like specifically with regard to economics. And so you'd be able to help to tailor your message based on what these benefits in the eyes of the economic development folks would be. The same if you're working with an environmental group, you'd be able to take a look at those parts of the matrix. Just a way of thinking about organizing your thoughts and really honing in on not necessarily what is important to you, but what is important to these partners that you're looking to bring on in your advocacy efforts, and making sure they understand how this fits into their overall work. So then we talk about developing an elevator speech. This is something that not a lot of us have any kind of experience with, but we'll actually make one of these during the next activity. And so we talk about, you know, what do you include in an elevator speech? What are some quick tips? I find these to be really helpful. Sometimes a little bit daunting too, to think, how am I going to build an elevator speech that's no more than 27 words and lasts no more than 9 seconds, where I'm not going to use any jargon, and where I'm going to tell a story, but it's doable and it's fun, and it's a skill that you can then apply to a lot of the work you do. But we'll do it here with regard to, you know, whatever that active transportation inequity is that you've identified in your community that you want to focus on, and come up with what that elevator speech might be. And then the last step is taking that elevator speech and thinking about crafting a campaign. And so, like I had said earlier, a lot of people hire marketing firms to do this. It can be a huge project, but there's no reason why you, as a local public official or a public health professional or someone affiliated with a school district, can't craft a quote-unquote campaign of your own, using that elevator speech, looking at what you want your advocacy issue that you're focusing on to be. And so we get into what these different specifications might be for your community. And we make sure to build in activities that make that possible. So you don't have to go back to your office and try to remember all of this. You actually have something in your hand when you leave that you can go back and say, hey, I went to this training. We started doing these things. We have a great start. Let's keep it going. So like I said, we do an activity here where you're working with your coworkers or with new partners that you've met during the training to craft your own message, and either become familiar with what that process might be like, or you can actually craft the message and use it. So I had mentioned how working with elected officials has been something we've heard that just seems like a daunting task to a lot of people, regardless of what their position is in their community or what their experience is with advocacy. And so we want to offer to you and the other trainees in these courses the information of how do you navigate the public process, how do you build advocates of current decision makers or future candidates, how do you target your messaging, and then how do you ultimately cultivate this culture of advocacy for active transportation in your community. I think we all know, we all do, you all do good work, and sometimes you may not feel heard, or some new inequity in active transportation comes up and you're not really sure where to start. Well, starting with those elected officials can prove to be really, really effective, and so we want to be able to help you understand how that might work in your community. So we talk about navigating the public process. We talk about all of the different methods of ways you might communicate with your elected officials. Some of these things are things that you're very familiar with. For example, you might write staff reports or memos all the time, but in what case is that the appropriate or best, most effective way to communicate these advocacy concerns with your elected officials? Or, maybe you are interested in public demonstrations and you feel like this is something that might call attention to your elected officials, but there is a policy in your workplace where it's not appropriate for you to be the one to do that. Well, then how do you navigate that? And so we talk a little bit about, the legalities behind things and what your position might be, but also what are all of the different ways that you might actually be heard by an elected official. And through our discussions, you might bring up specifics in your community that another person might say, hey, I thought no one else had that same problem, and then maybe we can come to some sort of conclusion on how to get past it together. So then we also talk about navigating the public process within the context of timing. So are you approaching elected officials about this active transportation inequity during a public comment period for a project? And if so, is that the most effective? And we'll talk about why it might be and why it may not be. What about if it's election season? How does that impact if and how much your messaging is heard? What sort of elected body are you choosing to reach out to? Is the transportation inequity that you want to advocate for or foster advocacy for something that's at your community level, or is it bigger than that? And if so, who do you go to? So then we also want to talk about two different facets of building these elected officials that are really into active transportation. So you have your current decision makers, and the way you go about communicating with them would be different than how you would go about communicating with future advocates. Future advocates being, in this case, people who would eventually become elected officials in your community. And we say elected officials loosely. This could be planning commissioners, this could be city council. So elected is just a way of describing, someone who is this higher level decision maker, whoever that may be in your community. We talk about targeted messaging. So we go through different scenarios of, what kind of questions would you or your group that you put together to work on this transportation advocacy issue actually be asking? And so these are ways for you to be able to be inspired to think about, okay, how would we frame this conversation with this particular person? How do we target the messaging to someone who we know what their interests are versus someone who we don't know as well, and we need to be a little bit more generic. So here are some more examples of what some of those questions might be, but as a group, we would all talk about different ideas of what might be more relevant in your community. So we also talk about, this idea of cultivating a culture of advocacy, and so how do we have local decision makers supporting active transportation? And so a lot of things that I'm sure you're familiar with that we'll talk about in more detail is getting them out into the community and actually experiencing what some of these issues might actually look like. Having them even use these interactive experiences is a great way to tout their own involvement in the community, whatever you need to do to make sure that they can start to understand why it is that you're so interested in transit, for example, or you're so interested in providing safe ways for children to get to school. So then finally, our last activity of the training is outlining your specific steps towards advocacy. And so this is set up in a way that if you're in the training with others who you work with on a regular basis, then you would be working with them on this. That way, all of your steps sort of match when you go back to work and start to collaborate on it further. If you're in the training with people you don't know, then it's an opportunity to hear from other communities and other groups about how they would go towards working on advocacy for active transportation in their community. But again, it's the whole idea of walking away from the training with something in your hand, something to get you started so that you don't feel like you're starting from scratch. So the full course agenda is here, like I had said. With it being a 4-hour training and having multiple activities, we still do fit in some what I like to call leg stretch breaks. Check your email, get up and walk around, do whatever you need. In some communities, depending on the time of day that you offer it, we build in a lunch break. So we're really flexible. Want to make sure that everyone's needs are being met, both in content, but also timing and whether or not they would be able to fit in having a lunch break or not. So if you're interested in this course or any of the other active transportation courses, you can, again, follow this link once you access it in the post-webinar posting. Otherwise, you can navigate on ODOT-LTAP's website to get to the Active Transportation Academy. The application is really simple and sweet. All we ask for you to do is commit to at least 15 participants and having a space for the training. If you feel like you can't think of 15 people that might want to come, let us know, and we are happy to work with you to reach out to neighboring jurisdictions or entities and work together to promote it so that we could have at least 15 people engaged in the training. We also ask for you to identify some preferences of dates when you'd like to host it, but otherwise, once ODOT lets you know if your request has been approved, then someone from my team reaches out and we talk to you in more detail about the logistics of it. So with that, I'll turn it back to Victoria. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer now, or as we had said at the beginning, you're always welcome to reach out directly.
There's a question being typed into the chat pod that I can see. I did post a couple of times while you were presenting, Amelia, that we were happy to take questions to the chat pod, but everybody must be saving them up to ask you once I unmute the phone lines. So I'm going to go ahead and start working through the unmuting of the phone lines. And if you have a party going on in the background, you might want to tell them to hold it down right now. We know if there's a barking dog, there's nothing we can do about that, but I'm going to go ahead and unmute everyone, and once you're unmuted, I'll let everybody know, and then you can feel free to ask any questions that you have of Amelia over the phone line. So I thought it was an excellent presentation, and it's a very different type of course, but one that's much needed. So everyone's unmuted now. Someone's still typing in the chat pod. So while they're finishing up, if you have any questions you'd like to ask over the regular phone line. Come on, I know you guys were saving them up, right? We're going to ask them all over the audio. That or you just did such a great job, Amelia, that they don't have any questions at all.
Or they're so confused they don't have any questions at all. We'll see.
No, you did a great job. Here we go. We've got the question that came up. It says, what role does a government agency have in this workshop or in hosting one, especially when you have advocates from different sides attending?
Do you want me to answer, Victoria?
Yeah, that's all yours.
Okay. So I think a great way to look at this is if you are a public entity who is hosting it, which in all regards you would be, you would have limitations on the type of direct advocacy work you as a government employee would be able to do, let's say, for example. So having advocates from different sides, if you will, come to a training is a way for you to be fostering advocacy efforts in your community, regardless of what side of the line they're on. It's still providing a service to your residents and your grassroots organizations to feel empowered to speak up and to be a part of this public process for trying to make change. And you, as the public entity who's working on engineering or planning or public health or safe routes to school or what have you, is a resource to them. And so being able to build that relationship and have everyone in the same room together at the same time is really a benefit of it. And so you wouldn't necessarily be there to do anything other than be another participant listening in the room, but it's a great opportunity for you to make that space available, and even at, through our tailoring of the materials, be able to make some assumptions about, based on who we know is coming to the training, build in some factual information into the presentation that would hopefully help them understand where their opinion falls and what kind of work is being done to address whatever the issues are that they feel are present.
Great. Thanks for the response. I'm not seeing any other questions coming into the chat pod, and everybody must have remuted themselves because we're not having any audio questions. So I want to thank you for your excellent presentation today. You always do such a nice job on these, and we are going to take a little hiatus for a couple of months, but was it March or April we agreed on for the next one?
I don't remember off the top of my head, but sometime in the spring.
Yes, springtime, look for an announcement. We do have Burton Planning, fortunately, with us for another year, and the Active Transportation Academy, and they will be developing some new courses this spring that we'll be putting some course overviews out for. But in the meanwhile, you have some great new courses that we've covered, over these fall months that you can request, and I'll follow up with everybody with a link to the recording and to the application and information about not only the advocating and active transportation course, but all the other courses offered through the Academy. So thank you everyone for your time today. Hope you enjoyed the webinar.
Thank you.